introduce our speaker today, but before I do so, just a little bit of background information. For those of you who are here for the first time, we are the Southeast Asia Research Center here at CityU, the only such research center in Hong Kong. And we try to bring together people interested in all sorts of issues related to Southeast Asia. We're very pleased today, however, to be discussing an issue which has been very much in the news. Even in today's South China Morning Post has probably saw discussion about Hong Kong's ability to deal with certain issues that some of which Wayne will be talking about today. We are almost through our schedule this semester. We've had, Wayne, you're the 7th speaker this semester. We've had a pretty active semester. We have one more talk that I want to let you know about, and that is Dr. Prajak Konyurati. He's a lecturer from Thammasat, a very talented and high-profile Thai scholar, very interesting time, of course, in Thai politics, talking about bullets, bosses, and ballots, electoral violence and democracy in Thailand, 1975 to 2011. That is on April 14th, same time at 4 p.m. on a Monday. The room number I'm not sure of, but you'll all be getting an email about that. Also, I just want to mention we have some materials here, both a brochure about our center and a number of working papers. But sorry to keep you waiting, Wayne. Very pleased to have Wayne Palmer today as our speaker. He's been a visiting scholar here at CERC since beginning of last month, I believe, is when you started. Yeah. This month, sorry, this month. Very recently started as a visitor here. He has been working on the human trafficking cases, working with the Indonesian embassy. He's written an article on extraterritorial interventions that the Indonesian consulate makes through public-private partnerships. He's contributed a book chapter to the role of discretion in handling human trafficking cases recently, and he submitted a doctoral thesis on the role of government officials' discretion in shaping and implementing Indonesia's state migration program at the University of Sydney last year, 2013. He's a senior client advisor at Christian Aid, Domestic Helpers, and Migrant Workers Program. Wayne is talking about, as I said, an issue of great interest. Thank you all for coming. And Wayne, we're very much looking forward to your talk. Thanks for being
here. Okay, I'd like to thank you all for coming today. I hope that one of the reasons why you're here is because your interest was piqued by some of the happenings here in Hong Kong this year. Around about January, we were reminded about some of the things that can go wrong for foreign domestic workers in Hong Kong. There was a case of an Indonesian domestic helper who experienced some things in her workplace with her employer, and also had some stories about her interactions with the employment agency after returning to Indonesia. The Indonesian consulate claims to have a very good working relationship with employment agencies in Hong Kong. And one of the things that I'm going to talk about today is how that system works and the kind of things that they can achieve. So to start the paper today, I want to introduce some of the key policies from Hong Kong and from Indonesia that shape the way that Indonesian domestic helpers experience life and work in Hong Kong. In particular, I'll look at Hong Kong's endorsement policy, something that the Immigration Department requires of all foreign domestic helpers before they enter into Hong Kong. The next thing that I'll look at is Indonesia's extraterritorial system for accrediting employment agencies in Hong Kong. What I'll then look at is how that system then impacts on practice within the recruitment industry, and then have a think about what this then means for the relationship that labor migrants have with not just their host state, but also the state in which they have citizenship, which is Indonesia. The Immigration Department in Hong Kong requires all applicants of foreign domestic helper visas to get endorsement from their consulate in Hong Kong. This policy, I'm trying to trace the history of this policy, and it looks as though it was introduced in around about the 1990s, around about the same time that the Hong Kong administration decided that it was no longer necessary to get approval from the Department of Labour to bring in foreign workers to work in households. The document that I've seen so far, the Immigration Department says that the policy was created as a courtesy for the main labor sending governments. At the time, that was mainly the Philippines. In Indonesia, only had relatively few people working in Hong Kong at the time. The number of Indonesians really started to take off after 1997. 1997 was a time of great economic upheaval in Indonesia. The Asian financial crisis meant that the Indonesian rupiah took a nosedive in terms of its value, and all of a sudden working overseas became much more attractive. The value of the Hong Kong dollar for people in Indonesia overnight became 4 times as valuable. So this then in Indonesia created demand to work in Hong Kong. So we can see from 1997 the number of Indonesians growing up drastically. It's also around about this time that we see the establishment of an association of employment agencies in Hong Kong that specialize in the recruitment of Indonesian citizens. This was their constitution is dated 1995. I suspect that one of the reasons that brought a recruitment agency in Hong Kong together was because around about 1995, perhaps they felt that the Indonesian consulates exercise of discretion whether or not to endorse employment contracts was a little bit unpredictable. I think they came together because there was perhaps a demand from within the industry to get some sort of commitment from the Indonesian consulate to say that they will give endorsements for these reasons, they won't give endorsements for these reasons. For the Indonesian consulate, this was also an attractive idea because the proposal was for this association that the Indonesian Consulate General would, within its organization structure, sit at the top. So we have a chairperson, which is usually a recruitment agency, but for the actual the political structure within the association, it's the Indonesian Consulate General. Then we have on the side we have advisors, and the advisor is generally the labor attaché. The first labor attaché to Hong Kong was deployed in 2005, but because there is such a high turnover of every 4 years, there's almost a complete turnover of home staff in the consulate. The people who remain there are the local staff. So what usually happens is when the labor attaché first arrives, usually it takes a bit of time for that labor attaché to establish some street cred. So the labor attaché is not usually allowed to be involved in the association. Usually needs to wait for some time to get the green light from the consulate general. The Indonesian consulate, the consulate's decision to require all Indonesian citizens to come to Hong Kong through employment agencies is not unusual. The Philippines does something very similar, but not all the consulates behave in the same way. The Indian consulate, for example, has no such requirements. The Indian consulate, which also has relatively few people working as foreign domestic helpers in the city, only requires its citizens to get the endorsement stamp. They can do this in person, or they can give somebody power of attorney to do it for them. So that in that case there would be 2 stages to apply for the endorsement. But there is no requirement that they have to come to Hong Kong through an employment agency. This is very different to the Philippines and Indonesia, which require all citizens who are coming from Philippines or Indonesia to enter into Hong Kong through the employment agency. There are some there are some practical reasons why the respective consulates require that. One of them is simply that they have a system at home where they only allow licensed recruiters to recruit people to work overseas. The other is that it also makes things administratively much simpler in Hong Kong. If you have a licensed intermediary in Hong Kong, this intermediary, which in Hong Kong is an employment company licensed by the Hong Kong Labour Department, this makes the application process much simpler for them. They don't have people arriving in Hong Kong on visitor visas with the intention to apply for an employment visa and then having to wait in Hong Kong or somewhere else for the visa to be issued. But these, each consulate has a slightly different system, a slightly different set of policies that they use to issue to endorse the employment contracts. If we look at the fact that the Indonesian consulate restricts the number of employment agencies in Hong Kong that are allowed to participate in the industry, the consequences can be very predictable without us even exploring some of the practices that happen. The most obvious one is something that I was quite excited to see in February. In February, the Legislative Council had a special panel where they wanted to discuss policies relating to foreign domestic helpers, also policies related to the regulation of employment companies. It's the first time that I've seen the Hong Kong administration put it on black and white, say that they first never required foreign citizens to come to Hong Kong through an employment company, and that restricting the number of employment companies that they license here in Hong Kong will result in some forms of monopolization. So they expect that by restricting the number of employment agencies in Hong Kong, that this will then limit the number of choices that foreign citizens have to require employment, and will, to a certain degree, mean that they will definitely mean that they have less choice. This will also mean that they have much less bargaining power. The Indonesian consulate licenses accredits around 230, 220. The Philippines, their accreditation system is much more liberal. Last time I checked was around about 350. But in Hong Kong there are around 1,100, 1,200 agencies that can recruit people from overseas to work as foreign domestic helpers in Hong Kong. So for Indonesians in Hong Kong, they really only have a choice of 220 agencies. Another policy that complicates things for Indonesians in Hong Kong is that the Indonesian consulate requires that they stay with the same agency from Indonesia for at least 2 years. So when they come to Hong Kong, they will come with what happens is a Hong Kong agency and an Indonesian agency will both stamp the employment contract. This to the Indonesian consulate makes things quite simple in the sense that they know who to call if they need someone to take financial or social responsibility for the migrant worker. If they, for example, need them to be repatriated. If, for example, wages haven't been paid, it's very clear for them who they need to call. It's practical in that sense. But in the first 2 years of employment, the Indonesian consulate will not allow an Indonesian domestic worker to change employment if they want to change the employment company in Indonesia. And the main reason for that, especially in the first 6 to 7 months of their employment here in Hong Kong, is that there is a recruitment debt that they incur in Indonesia, and this is something that I'd like to talk about more in detail. There's a lot of confusion around the fee that Indonesian domestic helpers pay here in Hong Kong. We hear some people say that it's an illegal fee. We hear some people say that it's overcharging. We hear some people say that it's illegitimate. What I really want to work through today is I want to introduce a typology of fees. I propose that we look at the fees that are charged to Indonesians in terms of looking at first whether or not the agency sees them as somebody that they've brought from Indonesia and overseas hire, or whether they see them as a local hire. And if we bring the fees into these two categories, then I think it's easy for us to make sense of whether or not the fee is illegal, and whether or not the fee is illegal. So the first typology of fees is one that I want to call overseas hire. I've chosen these terms because these are terms that are a common currency in the recruitment industry in Hong Kong. They have a third one, which is direct hire, but direct hire is not applicable for Indonesians. Indonesians are not allowed to come to Hong Kong if they don't move through an agency in Indonesia. So for overseas hires, there is actually a recruitment fee in Indonesia. This fee, to give you a bit of an idea of the history, this fee was in 1999. The Ministry of Manpower issued a policy saying that the fee could be equivalent to 18,000 Hong Kong dollars, and they had an itemization. Within that itemization, there was also something that was referred to as a management fee. The management fee, by memory, was around about $3,000. The management fee was a fee that was earmarked for employment agencies in Hong Kong. Within their role as manager, the idea was that the Hong Kong recruitment company would ensure that the domestic helper repaid the fee. What would usually happen is, as soon as they arrived in Hong Kong, they would take them to a public finance company, help them organize a loan, also take them to organize a Hong Kong identity card, and finalize other formalities before they started work. The other thing that they did ongoing was that they would make inquiries if, for example, a repayment had not been made. Another thing that they would do is often they would call the employer if they called repeatedly and got no answer from the domestic helper. We saw in 2004 this is shortly after Indonesia's first law that basically upgrades policies and regulations, upgrades them to the status of law in Indonesia, and actually stipulates a role for the state more widely to become involved in processes for not just sending Indonesians overseas, but also stipulates a role for the state to intervene overseas if something goes wrong. This is also something that the Indonesian state is still working on, still trying to work out detail. Also something that I suspect that a lot of officials have less interest in, but there is some movement in that direction. So around about the same time, the fee was reduced. The management fee disappeared. One of the reasons why it disappeared was because, according to Hong Kong law, it was illegal. In Hong Kong, recruitment agencies in Hong Kong can take a maximum of 10% of any worker's wage. You'll hear employment agencies in Hong Kong complain that 10% of a foreign domestic helper's wage is not very much. At the moment, it's $401 if their wage is $4,010. You'll hear them say that for $401, that doesn't cover operation costs and a litany of other things. Predictably, for private actors that are interested in profit, there were other ways that they clawed back some of the investment they made in bringing the Indonesians to Hong Kong. Also some of the and also what they saw as what they deserved in terms of profit. So this is when we started to see a huge departure from the fee that the Indonesian government allowed permitted Indonesians to pay and the fee that they paid in practice. So we saw up until around about 2012, Indonesians were paying 18,000 and then an extra 3,000 in interest for their loan. But the entire thing was incorporated into a single packet. In Indonesia, they'd signed a document saying that they agreed to pay 21,000 after they arrived in Hong Kong. The division between the capital that they borrowed and the interest was not made. But in 2012, what we saw was we saw the Indonesian Ministry of Manpower issue a regulation that made a very clear division of responsibility for costs. What we saw there was basically the Indonesian Ministry of Manpower decided that reading the employment contract for foreign domestic helpers in Hong Kong, decided that employers should pay for the ticket to Hong Kong, whereas formerly, even in former Indonesian in the former Indonesian policy, Indonesians had to pay for the ticket. What was happening in that period up until 2012? Basically, agents were collecting a double fee. So they were collecting around about 2,500 from Indonesians for the ticket to Hong Kong. They were also collecting that fee from employers. Employers thought that they were paying for it. But in 2012, working together with agents in Hong Kong, Indonesian consulate, and also the Indonesian Ministry of Manpower, we saw this item disappear. Indonesians were no longer responsible to pay for it. Another thing that we saw change was how it was financed. What happened previously is that Indonesians would arrive in Hong Kong with their documents. They would be taken to the public finance company. At the public finance company, then they would settle formalities. So then the loan would be issued. I have documents to show what the division of responsibility is for the loan. If, for example, they default in the first 3 months, what happens is the agent in Indonesia serves as guarantor. After those 3 months, it becomes the Hong Kong finance company, the money lender, that takes responsibility. But this shifted in 2012. The Indonesian government became more interventionist and set up became more interventionist and required that the amount of the loan, interest, and other items were detailed. So before they leave, now since around about the end of 2012, Indonesians have the option of taking out a loan for the amount of their recruitment fee. They're also told that for the loan they need to pay a certain amount of interest, and then also there's an administration fee because the loan is repaid over 6 months. When I say option, in theory, if you talk to employment agencies in Indonesia, they will always say that they gave the option to Indonesians. They could either pay the fee up front, or they could opt for the payment of fees after they arrived in Hong Kong. But if you talk to Indonesians, they'll say that they had very good reasons not to pay up front. And their reasons were generally just because they didn't trust that the employment agency would do what they promised. And that could be a range of things. That could be, for example, not having experienced that employment agencies don't necessarily give organized visas for people to work in the countries of choice. There's also a lot of they're very suspicious about how long they'll have to wait in training centers in Indonesia. Recruiters will often say that they can depart as soon as they get their visa. Coming to Hong Kong, if the policy for Hong Kong is that it usually takes between 4 to 6 weeks. But there's also people who've waited in training centers for much longer, sometimes 3 months, 4 months. Sometimes recruitment agents promise that they're organizing an employer, but they haven't done so. And you have people waiting there sometimes a year and a half. So there are very good reasons why they don't want to pay up front. So in their minds, they think, well, I also don't know who I'm going to work for. I have no idea after I arrive in Hong Kong whether or not I'm going to like the person I work for. I have no idea whether they're going to like me. So in a sense, they think, well, rather than take out a loan in Indonesia, rather than hand over land certificates, rather than give somebody else mortgage things that I own, I'll take the risk to see if for Hong Kong things work out. Then I'll make payments after I arrive. So there's the second typology of fees is one that I think where I think we can say now quite confidently that there are fees that are collected by Hong Kong employment companies that are not legal. This idea of local hire, the immigration department, if you ask them about this, they'll say that the intention was never, especially since the introduction of what they call the new conditions of stay in 1987. The intention was never that foreign domestic helpers wait in Hong Kong for a visa. The intention was always that they would come from overseas. And this was one of the reasons why in the employment contract that the employer is asked to pay for return package to and from that person's home. But one of the reasons why people choose to stay on in Hong Kong is because they fear that after they go back to, say, the Philippines or Indonesia, they worry that the recruitment agent, basically out of sight, out of mind. They worry that after they return to their home country, then the recruitment agency will no longer prioritize their visa application. So what they often choose is to wait in and around Hong Kong, and Hong Kong is in this in a very unique administrative place in that it doesn't take very long to cross to Shenzhen. It doesn't take very long to cross to Macau. The employment agencies in Hong Kong have made a business out of helping Indonesians and Filipinos mainly cross to Shenzhen and Macau and wait, and so they can wait for the 6 weeks in the area until their new visa is issued. The Indonesian government requires that Indonesian domestic helpers return to Indonesia. So what they want is that after a contract is finished, what they want is that the Indonesian citizen returns to Indonesia, comes back to Hong Kong with the agency that sent them in the first place, or through another agency. But in practice, they're actually quite happy to endorse employment contracts if the agency in Indonesia still agrees to take some form of financial or social responsibility for them, even though they never return. They wait around Hong Kong. The Indonesian Ministry of Manpower, in around about 2004, said that the recruitment agents in Indonesia were allowed to collect a fee of around $9,000, about $8,000, $9,000 from Indonesian domestic helpers if they were coming back to Hong Kong. So if they had already come here to work, but they were coming back to either work for a new employer or they were going to extend. It's this policy that's created a bit of confusion and opportunity for employment companies in Hong Kong. What we see is employment agents offering, for example, that they offer an extra service. They say, well, we'll pay for your return tickets to and from Macau. We'll organize your visa. We'll also undertake some of the costs for you to stay in Macau and wait for your visa. That's not the case. That's not the case for all agencies. The one example that I have here is that the employment agency has asked for $12,000, has asked for an upfront fee, but then at the bottom it said that any cost that the domestic helper incurs waiting in either Macau or in Shenzhen will be a cost that they need to pay for them. They pay themselves. The accreditation system that the Indonesian consulate operates here in Hong Kong has provided them with some very convenient usages. They can, for example, they can call employment agencies in Hong Kong to their office. For example, if there's someone who has been terminated, hasn't received a ticket, and needs to return to Indonesia, they can call the employment agent to the office to help them mediate the problem. They can also call them to the office if, for example, the domestic helper complains that their passport has been withheld, but they need it for example to return to Indonesia to visit family. But these instances where the consulate does so are usually ad hoc. They're usually because they've had a complaint. It's a convenient and quick way to solve the problem. But the convenience comes at a cost. The convenience comes at a cost to Indonesian domestic helpers, in that by limiting the number of employment agencies in Hong Kong and requiring them to move through employment agencies, it basically introduces an extra gatekeeper. The first gatekeeper being the Hong Kong Immigration Department. The second gatekeeper is the employment agencies, who then have the power to impose sometimes extra conditions, and those extra conditions might be extra payments. The first conclusion was more about policy. To move away from this, it might be interesting to start thinking about this, not just the policy that the Hong Kong Immigration Department has, but also the system that the Indonesian consulate has been able to build on the back of this policy. It's a system that basically, in some ways, gives the Indonesian consulate some more power to intervene in labor migration problems of their citizens. One of the questions that comes to my mind is, it's definitely attractive, but at the same time, is it really something that the Indonesian consulate should be taking on, given the fact that they have limited, not just limited financial and human resources capacity here in Hong Kong, but also that they operate in an extraterritorial context. Up until for many labor rights problems, it's the Labor Department in Hong Kong that takes responsibility. The Indonesian consulate can intervene when, for example, the process might take too long, or they need a more immediate resolution. But it's a situation that creates it's a system that creates a role for the Indonesian consulate to take some responsibility for citizens that should have very clear territorially inscribed rights here in Hong Kong. The relationships that are developed around the extraterritorial system. There's also there's a relationship between the Indonesian consulate and private recruitment agencies. In some ways, that's we see a kind of outsourcing of responsibility, claiming of responsibility in the first instance, but then outsourcing to private partners. These few examples will give us a much clearer picture, I think, of the relationship that labor migrants, particularly this category of labor migrants, have not just with their home state, but also with the state where they work.
Thank you very much, Wayne. We have plenty of time for discussion, and I'm sure there are many questions, but I'm very tempted to abuse my powers as chair to just very quickly 2 points. One is, if I understand correctly, you are, in a sense, showing how this 14-day rule plays such an important role, because the original idea was people are coming from abroad, So, I mean, a lot of the discussion that I've seen focuses on the way this 14-day rule, you know, once your contract expires and so on, you have 14 days to leave Hong Kong, right? So that is one of the key issues when it comes to abuse, because that gives, you know, domestic helpers very little leverage, right? They face that kind of thing. So am I correct, my first question, am I correct to link that to your point that what has happened is informally, a lot of people are actually looking at this more on a local, you know, local recruitment basis?
So this 2-week rule, it's sort of developed. The 2-week rule is also what is commonly known as the new conditions of stay. The idea was that the immigration department basically delinked residency with the right to work. So as soon as the employment finished, the domestic helper loses residency in Hong Kong. They're given, if it's terminated prematurely, they're given 14 days. But as soon as, for example, they file a claim with the Labor Department, they go to the Immigration Department to get an extension. It's automatically converted to a visitor visa. The business around local hires is developed out of that, and developed out of that in the sense that if the Immigration Department allowed foreign domestic helpers to remain in Hong Kong, change employees in Hong Kong, the business wouldn't exist. The business is there because the Immigration Department has done two things. The Immigration Department has linked residency to employment, and then at the same time, once foreign domestic helpers whose employment has ended to leave the country, what's happened is rather than return home, they go to Shenzhen and to Macau.
I think regardless of the 2-week rule, Indonesian migrant workers would still pay for the agency fee. Unlike Filipino workers, they have an option whether to be directly hired, which is like they would pay less than $1,000. And even if they will go out to Macau for 2 weeks or while waiting for their visas, they don't have to pay that much. Unlike Indonesian workers, whether they are locally hired or hired from overseas, like from Indonesia, they're still charged with these illegal fees, like huge amount. You mentioned 8,000 Hong Kong dollars. My question is, Hong Kong government, the Hong Kong immigration already said that employment agencies shouldn't impose fees. It should just be like around 10% of their monthly salary. So with this kind of imposition from the Hong Kong government and the Indonesian government's institutionalized fees of like 15,000. Like, how would you relate? How does these two state actors, because migrant workers are now trying to say like, but Hong Kong is not asking us to pay too much. Why are you charging us 15,000 Hong Kong dollars when Hong Kong government said it's only around $300-400 for a placement fee?
Okay, well, the fee that they initially pay to come to Hong Kong, that's a fee that's incurred in Indonesia, and discussions of like legitimacy of the fee aside, the processes in deciding how much is charged, what services are actually provided is a slightly different thing. But the second type of fee, so the fee that's charged to people who either want to change employers or come to Hong Kong for the second time, that fee and the confusion around it is because, particularly in the case of Indonesians, is that the Indonesian government wants employment agencies to be involved, because of the convenience that it provides to them. They can always call on somebody to intervene if, for example, there is an issue with the employer, they can't locate somebody. If, for example, they want the migrant worker to be repatriated. but that convenience comes at a cost. It is very unlikely that employment agencies in Indonesia would want to sign up to that kind of responsibility if there was not some sort of remuneration on offer. But what becomes difficult is that the system doesn't operate in the way that that policymakers in Indonesia imagine. Agencies in Indonesia would very much like the Indonesian domestic workers to return to Indonesia and then go back to Hong Kong. But what happens in practice is that they stay here in Hong Kong. So the agencies here, there probably are some that do collect that fee and remit some of it to Indonesia, but there are many more who don't. But the fact that the Indonesian government has a policy in place that agencies in Hong Kong can point to and say they're collecting this fee because the Indonesian government allows this fee to be charged is what creates the confusion. I think for other nationalities, it's much simpler. I think and I'm thinking here of Indians and Sri Lankans. For Indonesians, it's much more complex because the Indonesian government has this policy.
I am interested in the relationship between the recruitment agency in Indonesia and the employment agency in Hong Kong. How are they? What kind of working or partnership relationship do they have? Another question is about the financial institution that actually collect this money once they arrive here. You mentioned that the financial payment or arrangement is set up to take the monthly installment for 6 months. Who run these kind of institutions? Are they related to the Indonesian consul or Indonesian government? Are they mostly Indonesians? And it means that for the domestic work helpers, they have to live on like less than $1,500. So probably there should be some sort of enforcement mechanism that these financial institutions use.
That answers the first question about the relationship between agents in Indonesia and in Hong Kong. We're talking about industries in two different countries, also private actors. So the relationships are all very different, but there are some characteristics. If you talk to agents in Indonesia, they'll all say that agents in Hong Kong have the upper hand, and the reason why they have the upper hand is because they have access to employers. Agents in Indonesia have access to candidate workers, but the people who have access to employers and mechanisms for organizing visas are the agents here. A common term that's used in Indonesia for agents that are nominally Indonesian but are actually owned by Hong Kong permanent residents or permanent residents is they say something they call they'll say that the agency is either operated by remote control, or they'll say something like jual bendera, where it's nominally there's an Indonesian whose name is associated with the company, but actually it's for all intents and purposes controlled by an agency here. And I think if we look at the different ways in which fees are collected and remitted to Indonesia, that will often depend on the particular relationships between agents. But there are some things that they have in common. The Indonesian consulate requires agents in Hong Kong to sign something known as a cooperation agreement with agents in Indonesia, and in that agreement, it's both parties need to agree to basically they're going to recruit workers for a particular kind of work. There's a particular cost, and there's a particular method of payment. There are two basic characteristics. The first one is that there's a very unequal power relationship between the two, and the second is that the way that they operate is a very we're talking in Hong Kong also of 230 different actors. In Indonesia, you have what's commonly known as they have the main licensed companies and the sub-agents, and they can range anywhere from about 400 to 800. it's a very heterogeneous industry. As for financing, the up until things changed in around about 2012, it was possible to find, for example, even a former Indonesian consulate general on the board of directors of a finance company here in Hong Kong. It's also possible to find names of people in the Ministry of Manpower who are associated with companies. The financing arrangement up until 2012 was basically enabled by the context in Hong Kong. And because the way that moneylenders work here, it's much easier to get loans without having to, for example, provide own land, those sorts of things. I mean, the loans were for around about 18,000. After 2012, the Indonesian government restricted the number of moneylenders and has appointed a handful. But the handful that it's appointed are moneylenders that have agreed to only provide loans for the lower amount. The way that the arrangement that they have to repay the loan at the moment, it's about $2,543, I think, a month. It's a little bit lower than the previous $3,000 a month, but the Indonesian, I remember having a discussion with the Indonesian Consulate General here a few years ago. The basic issue there was that there is no moneylender in Indonesia that will provide a loan for that sum of money for somebody to go and work overseas, for the same reason that Indonesians don't want to pay up front. There's no certainty that they're going to retain the employment after they arrive. There's no certainty that they will make the repayments. So what they rely on is Hong Kong moneylenders.
Toby?
I was just wondering whether you could sort of big picture stuff, I guess, in terms of contextualising what you presented here, give us some idea of the sort of total formal and informal amounts related to this activity for both public and private actors. I mean, for the Indonesian government, for the agencies in Hong Kong, just to give us an idea of how much it matters to them in dollars, in dollar terms, and also the informal aspect as well. You know, what sort of informal fees are being paid in certain circumstances. And also, you touched upon this a bit in relation to the answer to Nan's question, but talk a bit about a question about the relative power and position of the different actors in relation to policy formation. I mean, do these agencies have, you know, a lot of lobbying clout in terms of working with the agencies here in other government departments in Hong Kong? What's the situation on the Indonesian side in that respect? So I can get a better picture of who's benefiting how much out of the different arrangements we're talking about.
Okay. For the recruitment agencies in Indonesia, the history of the industry in Indonesia, it basically developed out of a business to send Indonesians to work in Saudi Arabia, and so we see a lot of the policies that developed in Indonesia. That basically they were a reaction to what was needed to get Indonesians to work over there. Also some of the difficulties that the agencies had in profiting from the business. That was from the 1980s. In Indonesia, we've seen, especially since 2004, when the law was introduced, that basically stipulates a responsibility for a range of government agencies to somehow become involved in shaping processes. It means that more people are starting to have a say, whereas previously it was exclusive to the Ministry of Manpower that decided policy regulation, and that also, and even within that was one small director general. You can see by talking to people in the Ministry of Manpower, the relationship with the employment companies sometimes is quite close. sometimes it can be, in some circumstances, it can be much more antagonistic. But what we also see in Indonesia is that it's a very common experience that government agencies are not given adequate budgets to do the work that they're asked to do. In this particular government Director General, they also have a mandate to visit countries overseas to, for example, talk about memoranda of understanding, to also identify new opportunities for Indonesians to work overseas. I mean, these things need to be bankrolled by somebody. You won't see anything on paper that contributions are coming from employment agencies. But if you talk to anyone, you'll start to build a very clear picture that they're involved in financing what is actually state business. And with that also comes the ability to, I guess, negotiate terms in policies, and also negotiate how policies are implemented. That's on the Indonesian side. On the Hong Kong side, I'm much less familiar with how employment agencies how they relate to those in the Labour Department. I hear from people working in the ILO that actually it's not that different. Even anecdotally, when we were at the program that I work on now, when we come across evidence of that recruitment agencies in Hong Kong have charged fees that perhaps they shouldn't have, we find that their response is very bureaucratic and unresponsive. That to us suggests that it's actually something that's quite new. That complaints are made. If we look at last year, for example, the Labour Department either cancelled or refused to renew licenses for employment companies. But in Hong Kong, if you talk to any Indonesian, they will all give you a story. If they've worked here for more than one contract, they'll all give you a story about having paid, for example, I can think of a client that we had not too long ago. She was pregnant, and she knew that it would be difficult to find an employer, but an employment agency offered to find her an employer if she paid $10,000. That's a slightly extreme example, but it's no different really to the people who stay here and look for a second contract on the local hire.
Maybe just to follow up, can you give us any numbers, follow up on Toby's question about the kind of money that's involved in all this process? Do we have any figures about the amounts of money?
Yeah, I mean, I was sort of interested in terms of total revenues, I mean, what sort of money are we talking about flowing through in terms of fees, both, and also the composition of the size of the industry? You know, in Indonesia, do you know what it's actually worth, and what remittance flows are, for example, returning remittance flows from Indonesian workers?
I mean, remittances to Indonesia, there are. I mean, it's in the billions. But I mean, those remittances usually go to supporting consumption in village areas. I find that's a little bit misleading to talk about it as something that benefits the Indonesian government. What I've seen in places in Indonesia, that it might help, for example, to lay cement in a house. It might help, for example, to buy a motorcycle for a cousin. It might help to pay for schooling. Collectively, it provides it gives a huge development benefit in Indonesia.
But the fees are charged by the governments, right?
The fee's not charged by the government.
It's
It's charged by employment agencies in Indonesia.
Okay, so the Indonesian government makes no money.
The people who profit, the people who profit from the business are the employment agencies. The people who pay are the migrant workers, and the people who benefit from the labour in that period where they're not receiving wages are the employers. But if we want to think about perhaps how much the business is worth. A simple calculation of the number of Indonesians in Hong Kong. So if we have 140,000 here, there's, with very little exception, because of the endorsement policy, which gives the Indonesian consulate control over who can come in and who can't. We would multiply that by the fee that they pay, which is around about 16,000. The amounts, then we can break that down into the amounts that moneylenders in Hong Kong make out of the business, and then the balance is what Indonesian employment agencies make. But then again, sometimes employment agencies in Indonesia, although they claim to collect this fee, to maintain a working relationship with employment agencies in Hong Kong might not collect a whole lot. They might send some back. But those arrangements are very, they'll depend on the particular relationship between agents.
They said that the Indonesian government is not, getting anything from these fees, but based on the research that we've done before, they said that's why Terminal 3 in Indonesia, in Jakarta, is there, because that's where all the legal fee or all the fees that would, go to the government. I'm not sure if you've
There are lots of businesses that are built around Indonesian labor migration. What was Terminal 3? It's no longer mandatory for Indonesians to report once they go home. But there are lots of businesses that were built around it. One was, for example, in that particular airport, there was a licensed money changer, so you could only change your money at a particular lender. There was also licensed transporters, so you were only allowed to take your transport from the airport to your place of origin with a government licensed transporter. That's no longer mandatory. It's now optional for Indonesians to report when they come home. But what we often see at the airport is that sometimes there's a bit of confusion about how optional it is, and you'll see sometimes officials from that government agency approaching people to ask if they want to report. Now they see, from what I saw on my last trip there, now I see that they sit at their desk and they wait to be approached. Whereas before they'd usually wait just around the arrival area, and they'd identify people that they thought looked like people who were returning from work abroad, and that was enabled by profiling, basically. If you dressed in a particular way, if you were carrying a certain kind of thing, then you were obviously somebody working overseas as a domestic helper. But that terminal, it's no longer mandatory. It's now optional.
Wayne, two further questions. One is, you offer a very measured assessment of the Indonesian consulate. That is not the impression I get from what one hears is being said by many Indonesian helpers about the Indonesian consulate. Can you comment on that? Why is there so much distrust of the consulate, given the way you described it, as the consulate is underpaid, it's trying to deal with a large number of people, 140,000 with limited resources, with changing staff, but there's a lot of anger, I think it's fair to say. I found this interesting about these protests in the last few weeks, not just directed at the Hong Kong employers and their abuses, but also at the consulate. The second question is, going on to your second conclusion, one thing one finds in Hong Kong, again, this is anecdotal, but people in Hong Kong tend to see it as an Indonesian problem, even though it's here, and the abuses and all the problems are occurring here, but it's sort of, your analysis sort of explains why, because we've got this very murky, as you say, extraterritorial sort of system that's been set up. But that has led to the impression, and then one of the disconnects, I think, in the debate here is you get these reports of abuses and people in Hong Kong are saying, oh, it's not our fault.
Okay. So the Indonesian consulate, if you talk to Indonesians who've been here since shortly following the end of the Suharto regime, after 1998, you'll see people who are saying that during the 1990s, the Indonesian consulate really could not care less. But what they will tell you is that since that time, the Indonesian consulate has become more responsive. One of the reasons why it's become more responsive is that there's been a professionalization of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Indonesia. There's been an establishment of what's known as a citizen protection committee within each of the embassies and consulates, and we can see that if we visit Singapore and Kuala Lumpur. One of the reasons why Indonesian citizens in Hong Kong are so rightly angered by the consulate is because the Indonesian consulate is still struggling with the idea that they're here to service Indonesian citizens, whereas before they saw that their mandate in Hong Kong was perhaps to maintain bilateral relationship with the Hong Kong administration. Perhaps their role here was to foster a relationship with the business community. But since the late 1990s, there's been a push for the Indonesian consulate to become more responsive to the needs of Indonesian citizens. And so we've also seen the introduction of, on Sunday now, the Indonesian consulate opens for a limited number of hours for Indonesians to come to talk about a range of problems, often labour issues. Before that wasn't a possibility. It's also possible to apply for a passport extension or passport renewal online, whereas before that wasn't possible. You'd have to go to the Indonesian consulate either Monday to Friday. But Monday to Friday are the days where Indonesian domestic helpers are working and not able to leave home. So there are definite moves towards I guess a much more professional, much more sensitive approach to providing service to Indonesian citizens in Hong Kong. But it's something that is definitely a working process. I think with definitely if you talk to any Indonesian domestic helper here, if the interaction between them, the Indonesian consulate and the employment agency, they will always tell you that the Indonesian consulate seems much closer to the employment agency, in the same way that they'll tell you that the employment agency is also much closer to the employer. But what we're definitely seeing is slowly the introduction of policies and structures in the Indonesian consulate that is in some ways forcing the staff who are there to be a little bit more responsive to the needs of Indonesian citizens. The second question about it being a problem, an Indonesian problem, not a Hong Kong problem. If you talk to anyone in Indonesian consulate, they'll say the same thing, but basically that it's a Hong Kong problem and not their problem. And the case in point is how to respond to a case of abuse, like about what happened to Erwian and Sulistyaningsih in January. The Indonesian consulate will say, well, it happened in Hong Kong. It was a Hong Kong employer. Yes, we might have an accreditation system that requires where we can require the employment agency to intervene. But at the end of the day, it's an employment agency that's licensed by the Labour Department. They'll also say, well, how is it possible that an Indonesian domestic helper arrives at the airport with bruises and has clearly had an experience that might involve abuse? How is that person allowed to exit Hong Kong? In this particular case, she was provided with a wheelchair. The immigration officials helped her with a wheelchair from the immigration desk to the waiting room. They wonder why in Hong Kong at airports it's so difficult for pregnant women at a certain stage of pregnancy to board a flight. But how is it possible for somebody who can't walk to the waiting room? Why is it possible for them to board a flight? So there's a lot of back and forth about responsibility, but there's definitely a feeling within the Indonesian consulate that really, with especially evidence of abuse, evidence that labor rights haven't been respected, that these are clearly responsibilities of the state that has much more capacity to deal with the problem. That they have a police force, they have an immigration office, they have a labor department, they have mechanisms to deal with it. For Hong Kong administration, I think it's convenient. To have the Indonesian consulate be able to intervene. But from what I've seen so far, I don't feel that it's in the best interests of labour migrants to have a small office with a limited number of people take responsibility for ensuring that their citizens receive appropriate treatment from local government organisations and in their workplaces.
Are there any other questions?
I would like to know about the working mechanism of sub-agents and brokers in Indonesia, and how do they get payments, whether they got paid by the employment agency or the migrant worker candidates, or both.
Okay.
Yeah.
Agents in Indonesia. There's a very big network of them, and they're unofficial. In Indonesia, you have licensed employment companies, and often in these companies they don't have direct access to places where there are people who want to work overseas. What they often rely on is some kind of intermediary. And that intermediary is often what is referred to as a PL, petugas lapangan, or a sponsor. And these people usually recruit to village areas, and they collect a fee from the Indonesian agency. That fee, up until recently, was around about 5 million rupiah, which is about 4,000 Hong Kong dollars. And then some of that fee is dispersed to the candidate as what they call it wang saku, pocket money, and that's to encourage them to sign up for the migration process. I remember it surprised me quite a lot in Indonesia. I first heard about this wang saku here in Hong Kong, and so I started asking people, how much did you get? How much did you get? The amount can be anywhere between zero if they're not very clever. If they know about that they can get some of the fee, it'll be up to about 2.5 million. So this is almost like it's an unofficial business in Indonesia, but it's how most of the agents receive candidates to work overseas.
So they are paid only by the workers' candidates, not by the employment agencies.
Sorry?
They are paid by worker candidates, not by the employment agencies.
Oh no, they're paid by the agencies.
Also, they are paid
It
by
used to
both
be
sides.
up until 2004, when criminal sanctions were introduced for unofficial intermediaries. Usually fees were collected from the candidates, usually about 500,000 rupiah. But since then, and especially with the greater risk that comes that is involved with getting documents that on the face of it at least comply with Indonesian law, that for example they're at least 21 years of age and so on and so on. The greater risk that comes with getting those documents and cost means that they play a very big role for the recruitment agents, and they're willing to pay a much higher fee for the service.
What do you see? No, sorry. How do you see about the KTLN policy of Indonesian government? Just it. KTLN, kartu tanda tenaga kerja luar negeri. Domestic worker, Indonesian domestic worker, get a lot of advantage from this policy?
The card was introduced quite a while ago, but like many things, it's often done in stages. So the card was introduced, but it had absolutely no function. But Indonesians had to have it. now the card associated with the card is basically it's a way for the Indonesian government, if it works well, it's a way for the Indonesian government to have all details, including name, date of birth, passport number, insurance policy number, name of employer, address of employer, all in one place. In practice, it doesn't work like that. In practice, it's much like an overseas identity card that has a photo on it. In Indonesia, there's disagreement about how mandatory it is. Law says that it's mandatory to have the card, but the immigration, the Immigration Director General decided last year that they weren't going to stop Indonesians leaving to work overseas if they didn't have the card. So there's disagreement even among Indonesian government agencies about what role it should play. But if you check in Indonesian domestic helpers' passport, if they've come under the official program, they'll have a stamp that has their card number in there. Sometimes they might not hold the card. Some of the reasons for that are that recruitment agencies in Indonesia might confiscate the card. They might not also provide them with the name, the number of their insurance policy. But there's for Indonesians in Hong Kong, I've seen many more of them now holding the card than 4 years ago.
Can these Indonesian domestic helpers get another loan? I mean, to me, surviving on less than 1,500 a month, let alone not be able to send any money back to their families in Indonesia, it just seems to be impossible. So I wonder whether they can go for another loan to survive. How can these women migrant workers can have a better situation? I mean, it's such a bleak picture, and I hope it won't continue. So, is there any way of breaking the beginning of the vicious circle so that these women can have a better status in relationship with the employment agency?
Indebtedness is a very big problem. It's not just a problem for Indonesian migrant workers coming to Hong Kong. For Indonesians going to Singapore and Malaysia, for example, what happens is there's no money lending system that allows them to take out a loan and then repay it through a third party. So what happens is employers pay for the recruitment fee. They pay it to the employment agency, which then transfers part of it to Indonesia, or all of it. But then what happens is the employer recoups the fee from the wages. So I mean, in fact, it's the same. It's the same system. It's post-deployment payment of fees, but the common factor there is that it would be possible to reduce indebtedness in the system if somehow there was a way of financing Indonesian labour migration that didn't rely on post-deployment payment of fees. I'm sure that there are many different ways we could think of many different scenarios, but the problem is in Indonesia, at least, that there's that moneylenders are not prepared to give money for people to work overseas because of the risk involved. Indonesians are also not prepared to pay because they don't know whether it's going to work out or not. On the other hand, it might be difficult to ask employers to cover the cost, because for them there's an equal risk. They might have spoken to the person over Skype, but they don't know whether the person is going to, one, be the worker that they imagined. They also don't know whether the person is going to stay or not. It's difficult. I mean, the problem is that there are costs involved with labor migration. The question is, who's going to pay for it?
Just want to ask. Actually, sometimes there would be double charging, because like after a few days, when some of the employers, they don't like just the physical features of the workers, they would terminate the workers right away. So the workers would end up with employment agencies, and then if the agency would find another employer, this Indonesian worker would have to pay another agent, another fee. So it's like they have a double fees that they need to pay for the recruitment agency. And as far as I know, the employers actually connive with employment agencies, because the payments for the recruitment fees, they don't give it to the migrant workers, but they pay the salary directly to the to the agencies.
That arrangement is actually much rarer for Indonesians. I have seen a couple of examples where employers will pay recruitment fees directly to the agency, but the most common one is that the employer will pay the wages to the domestic worker, and then they will pay the fee. For the double payment of recruitment fees, this also comes back to the fact that the Indonesian consulate requires them to be associated with an employment agency in Indonesia. It is actually possible to ditch the agency in Indonesia and use the services of another agency here in Hong Kong, but with that there's a cost involved in that. And what the Indonesians call it, they call it tutup mulut, point tutup mulut. So basically they'll pay a certain fee, maybe $8,000, and then that money is given to the agency in Indonesia to be quiet. So they've got their due. They'll unlock the worker from the system and allow them to change to another agency. But that really, the reason why that happens at all is because the Indonesian government and the Indonesian consulate here in Hong Kong tie Indonesian migrant workers to agencies. If they weren't tied to agencies, that wouldn't be an issue.
It's still common about the charge of the agency fee. For example, the domestic worker who came from Indonesia, and then the agency would charge for 15,000 or 16,000. After she's working in Hong Kong 3 months, and then they will be terminated by the employer, and somehow the agency going to give her prospect employer, and again they hire again, but the agency would charge her for starting from the beginning another 6 months. I have quite common and seeing many Indonesian workers that even they already 1 year working in Hong Kong, and not even 1 month have experienced receive full salary because of the terminated, often terminated, something like that. But I don't know if there's an issue that the immigration department will not process the working visa if the domestic helper already terminated 3 times within a year. If that would have helped the domestic worker to make a better situation, or it will be even worse because then they cannot work in Hong Kong for that. What do you think about that?
Indonesians that I've spoken to, there is a lot of fear about not finishing contracts and what the immigration department will think about that. And that fear comes from a number of places. One comes from also the immigration department not being extremely transparent about the things that they take into account when they assess applications. The other thing is that employment agencies in Hong Kong will tell them that if they terminate their employment, or that they're terminated prematurely, that the immigration department will look on that unfavorably, which they do. One of the things that the Indonesian consulate started doing, and I understand that they're also working with the Philippines consulate, is to collect the names of employers that they identify as have somehow been problematic. And they share these with the immigration departments. At the same time, they ask the immigration department for reasons why they refuse applications. The immigration department will say it's because an employer has reported that this worker has not completed 1, 2, 3 contracts. But at the same time, they're not transparent about about the details that they maintain about employers.
Wayne, perhaps just one other question is, given how lucrative this whole business is, and you've sort of described this setup, which obviously is not to the benefit of the helpers themselves, but to the agencies and so on, how serious do you think the Indonesian government really is about changing things in 2017, as they claim they're planning to do?
2017, so I assume you're talking about the idea that they won't be sending domestic helpers overseas.
Yeah.
I think the Indonesian government has, I can see since the 1980s, when they first started sending domestic helpers to Saudi Arabia, was already saying that they were going to stop the number of informal workers sent overseas, that they were going to prioritize the recruitment of Indonesians with skills to get higher wages overseas. I don't see how it's going to be possible to change that between now and 2017, for the main reason that there's the reason why there are so many Indonesians who are willing to work overseas as domestic helpers is because there's no viable work option, employment option in Indonesia. So I think until somehow a solution can be made about providing adequate employment in Indonesia, I don't think that the Indonesian government can really predict what sort of jobs that people are going to leave the country and look for overseas.
Thank you very much, Wayne. Thank you for the question.